Great. Okay, well, hello everyone. We still have 1 more minute, so maybe we'll just wait that extra 30 seconds to make sure that everyone can join the stream and get us here. But we are ready to do our panel on navigating the food safety and regulatory landscape for cultivated meat, and we're all really excited to be here today. So just wait till that 11:59 turns to 12 here in Eastern Time. Maybe we'll just do a quick mic check just to make sure everyone is okay. Elliot, I haven't heard from you yet, so just want to make sure. Yeah, perfect. And
yeah,
Dwayne?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Dwayne?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, and Mariela and Brian?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, well, welcome to everyone joining us today from all around the world, I think, and to the esteemed panelists to be on this discussion panel, Navigating the Food Safety and Regulatory Landscape for Cultivated Meat Production, hosted as part of the Cultivate Tomorrow Hackathon. So cultivated meat has emerged as a promising solution and has a potential to address some of the most pressing issues facing our world. However, as with any emerging industry, navigating the regulatory landscape can be complex and challenging. And today we have a really great panel here to help us through that. This is a really exciting time for the regulatory and safety advancement of cultivated meat products. There's been progress in, of course, US and Singapore and some other places in the world. We see lots of regulatory submissions going in, so I'm sure we'll hear more about that. So today, the panel brings together experts from various fields to share their insights and experiences. This is going to be critical for the success of cultivated meat production. So it is an honor to have such a distinguished group of panelists who bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise. So the goal today is to provide valuable insights and foster some productive discussions. We will explore the challenges and opportunities in the regulatory landscape. So I do encourage everyone to put your questions into the comments. We will try to get to as many as possible today. And yeah, again, we thank the panelists for joining us and looking forward to this discussion. So first, maybe we'll do just a round of introductions, just so we get to know everyone a little bit. I'll just quickly start. My name is Kim Ong. I am from Vireo Advisors. We are a company that who consults with companies and help them get their novel products, including cultivated meat and seafood products, through the regulatory process, and also look at a range of safety issues. I was one of the vice chairs of the FAO WHO expert consultation on food safety aspects of cell-based food, and that was published just a couple of weeks ago, so I encourage everyone to go read that. Vireo also works with New Harvest, a nonprofit supporting cellular agriculture as part of the Cultured Meat Safety Initiative. So the goal of that is to stimulate research on the safety of cultivated meat by kind of figuring out what the priorities are for research in the eyes of different stakeholders. Our first phase was focused on industry views, and we just completed phase 2 with regulatory scientists. So we have actually just submitted the results of that whole interview and consultation process. So if you want to read it, we have put it up. It is not peer reviewed yet, but it is on preprint.org. So I encourage everyone to go there and take a look at those results. Okay, with that, let's start with some intros. So maybe I'll pass it off to Mariela.
Hi, Kim. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. My name is Mariela de Amstalden, and I am an assistant professor in intellectual property and innovation law at the University of Birmingham Law School, where I teach primarily intellectual property law and international dispute resolution. I'm extremely pleased to be here, especially among colleagues in this panel. It's exciting times for the cellular agriculture industry. I guess the way that I come into this field as an international economic lawyer by training is to look at how the sphere of cellular agriculture has developed distinctively from what we know as traditional food law. And so to that aim, I am actually writing a monograph about the cellular agriculture legal spaces where we are looking at different regulatory approaches that we've been identifying worldwide. And that is why I am particularly excited about the work that's being conducted at the codex level, because in my view, that will simplify a lot of potential issues, and that will probably potentially prevent certain issues from happening in the first place, at least from a legal perspective. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariela. And then Brian.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here on this panel. My name is Brian Sylvester. I'm a lawyer at Covington and Burling in the Washington, D.C. office. In the past, I worked at USDA, which is one of the regulators of this technology, and I worked there for about 5 years. Today, I work with many food and beverage companies, including companies in the cellular agriculture space. And I was just reflecting that it was about 5 years ago on July 1st that I published an article in Food Safety News that sort of thought about how this technology could be regulated. It was just a thought that came to me to write this kind of how the legal precedent applies to the technology. And it's been really amazing for me to see how everything has evolved over the past 5 years, and to see like FDA giving the green light to technologies, and there's more to come. So looking forward to the conversation today with everyone.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, Dwayne.
Hi. Pleasure to be here. My name's Dwayne Holmes, and I'm a director at New Harvest. We're a nonprofit that's dedicated to advancing cellular ag for the public good. My background is in molecular and stem cell biology, and after graduation, I joined MosaMeat, where I headed their quality assurance and regulatory efforts for 2 years. Main thing is putting together a safety dossier in different jurisdictions. During that time, I really engaged with New Harvest and Vireo during the workshops towards the safety paper. And so I was on that. And then after I left MOSA, I was asked to join New Harvest and kind of work on some issues that I saw in the industry. I thought that was a good challenge. And I've joined New Harvest as director. And we've continued working on the safety work, which now Kim had just talked about. We just have this new safety paper out. I guess I'll leave it there for right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Dwayne. And Elliot.
Yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Elliot Swartz. I am one of the scientists at the Good Food Institute, which is another nonprofit in the sector that aims to advance alternative protein technologies. And I focus on cultivated meat. So I spend, I think, most of my time thinking about what are the technical and economic bottlenecks that are facing the industry, but I've also worked on projects ranging from the environmental impact and understanding that, as well as food safety, where I also participated in the FAO meetings in Singapore with Kim last November. And so looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great. So as we can see, we have a really wide depth of experience here: academia, law, industry, nonprofit. So really, really excited and diving on all kinds of issues here. So I think maybe let's start with a bit of a primer here. Maybe we can provide our audience with a bit of a background about the regulatory status of cultivated meat and seafood products around the world, and maybe commenting a little bit on how the regulatory process may be the same or may differ from novel foods or other conventional meat and seafood products, let's say. So maybe Brian, perhaps we can start off with your experience in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the United States, we have two major food regulators: the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and then the USDA, where I worked. And for products that are available in the marketplace, meat and poultry products are subject to USDA regulation, and certain types of egg products. And then everything else really falls under the umbrella of FDA. I'm kind of oversimplifying. There's some certain exceptions there, but for our purposes today, I think that should suffice. And so what I was referring to back in 2018, when there was somewhat of a turf war between the two regulators, they were trying to figure out like how would we regulate this technology that's produced without animal slaughter. And so the regulators in 2019 came up with a memorandum of understanding between the FDA and the USDA. And they said that the FDA, if you're making a meat or poultry product, which is normally regulated by the USDA, that FDA would regulate the process up until the point of harvest from the bioreactor, after which USDA would take over. USDA also has labeling regulatory oversight for meat and poultry products made through cell culture technology. And if you're making a seafood product, for example, that would totally be regulated by FDA if it's made through cell culture technology. In that case, that means safety and labeling, all of that is totally regulated by the FDA. So I think at a high level, that's how I would kind of frame it out. Again, there's certain exceptions. For example, USDA has oversight for catfish just more broadly, and that's more for political reasons. I haven't heard of any cultivated meat companies making cultivated catfish yet, so I don't think that's an issue that we need to address today. So I would just think of it as meat and poultry, FDA, USDA work together, and if it's just seafood, then it's just FDA. And there's a lot to unpack in there, and the companies that I've had the privilege of working with have been really focused on the FDA piece in particular, which is really just everything up until the point of harvest, and putting together a submission that explains the safety assessment that the company has performed. And I think what's been challenging for companies is that there's not any written published guidance yet from the FDA or the USDA for that matter. So there's been a lot of engagement. And I would say from my perspective, the regulators have been very open and very, they really want to talk to and engage with industry to learn more about the technologies. And now we're starting to see some technologies come through successfully. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to my panelists.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, lots to unpack in the US, and we'll go into that in a bit, but maybe we can get a little bit of insight into the EU. Perhaps, Dwayne, do you want to take this one on?
Sure. So broadly speaking, cultured meat will fall under the category of novel foods unless the cells involved are genetically modified, or you have some components that are going to be genetically modified that are in this. So novel food it's a broad category, and it's any food that has not been consumed in member states of the EU, very simply, and that can include like insects, right? A new insect that comes in, or you've got a new plant that you're bringing in that's not been consumed. And then what you do is you actually apply you apply to the European Commission. It will then request a safety review by the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, and that's where you'll send your dossier. There's some guidance that's there. It's not specified or specific to cultured meat. It's kind of a generic thing, but you follow these guidelines, prepare a dossier, you submit your dossier. If you get a good review, you pass their review, then it will go back to the European Commission, which will then write a law saying to put this food product in. It could be allowed in the European Union, but then it goes from there to another committee. It's called the PAF committee, and this is more of a political decision. So it's made up of representatives from member states, and they can deliberate on this law. They can send it back for review or additions. But then once if it gets past there, then your food will end up in the Codex. It'll be able to be sold in member states, but now it's up to the member states to actually enforce the law and basically implement it. So I think that's like a really brief way of discussing it. But it's very different if you have a genetically modified product. Then it goes under the GM pathway, which you could say is similar, but it's even more rigorous.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dwayne. Mariela, would you be able to give us some insights into the UK and what the status is there?
Sure. I should have mentioned at the beginning that I am currently on secondment with the Food Standards Agency here in the UK. So anything that I say here is obviously on a personal capacity, and I will try to keep it quite general for obvious reasons. So I hope that you understand. So I guess the key point that I want to highlight is the fact that we are living in a post-Brexit world, and that has huge implications for anything that has to do with food safety in particular. As we know, food is a highly regulated area, and up to the point of Brexit, it was highly tied to what Dwayne was talking about the EU regulatory framework. It continues to be in a way, but current political developments indicate that might no longer be the case. So we are basically waiting to see how the UK decides as to what is their preferred regulatory approach. With that, what I mean is the UK going to continue following EU legal standards? My assumption is no, that will not be the case for obvious political reasons. So, and if that is not the case, does that mean that the UK, apologies, will try to align perhaps its regulatory framework towards what we see in the US? And that has very specific implications when we talk about novel foods and when we talk about GMOs, because as we know, or we might know, that GMOs are very differently regulated when it comes to the EU and the US. And so there are a lot of considerations that go beyond law. And that has perhaps a lot to do with consumer acceptance, consumer trust, but also with public policy imperatives, what the regulator has in mind as a priority, right? It is perhaps less, I would tend to say, it is less to advance an industry or a field of scientific inquiry, and more about ensuring that there is public trust in the food safety of the products that are placed in the market.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mariela. And Elliot, I know that you have a depth of knowledge in global issues, even though you're based in the States. Dealer's choice, I'll leave it to you. Are there other areas that you feel need to be highlighted?
Well, I think just at a meta level, sort of the observation that I would add here is that, different regions that have already novel foods frameworks in place have generally said, cultivated meat can sort of fit within that framework. So examples of that would be places like the EU, also Australia, New Zealand. I believe Canada sort of fits that picture as well. So there are different countries or regions that I think have made it a little bit clearer for cultivated meat manufacturers. And then there are places that are a little bit less clear, where it's not as easy as a fit into existing frameworks. So places like Japan, for instance, have to potentially sort of reformat some of the ways that they might look at cultivated meat within their existing frameworks. I think China is also potentially doing something similar in other regions of the world. So I think that's like a meta level observation that I can point to at this stage in terms of the development of these different frameworks.
Great. So we know that there have been a couple authorizations that have gone through in Singapore. The first being in 2020, which feels like so long ago, serum-free chicken in early 2023. And of course, in the US, we had the Upside dossier reviewed in October 2022, and the Good Meat very recently in last month. So I'm just wondering, from the view of the panelists, was there anything surprising or anything new that we learned from these authorizations or reviews that have occurred recently? Let you sit for this again. Maybe Dwayne, looks like you have something to say.
No, actually, I was trying to think if there's anything that was learned, but I was thinking it might be useful to discuss a little bit of the difference between Singapore and the other ones, because we discussed some of these, but there is a different. Singapore has a different system, the way they do things. Well, in a way, you have some pre-submission consultations in the U.S. But I want to define this, a difference with the EU, right? So in Singapore, when you go to, well before you submit your dossier, they would like you to already start talking with them. So the safety places SFA, and you can have, they want dialogue starting even from very early. This can even be before you start your safety experiments, right? Safety tests, and that's something that's not available in the EU. So, and it's something that actually, you could say, speeds or assists your ability to develop your dossier, because you will know what analytics they are really wanting. So they can take a look at what your process is. They can say, oh, these are the kinds of things we'd like to see. And you develop what your safety dossier will look like, and your analytics, so that by the time you submit your dossier, it's really well prepared. Whereas in the EU, I mean, now after a transparency law, there's like a minor kind of an online version of asking information about what you might want to submit, but it's not this real-time dialogue. And so what you'll do is you'll submit your application, your dossier, but there'll be a lot of questions remaining. And so there'll be a lot more post-submission work for the EU rather than in Singapore. And so one of the things is in Singapore, well, another thing in Singapore is once you get your acceptance, there is no information shared from Singapore. You get a certificate saying you can sell. Whereas in the EU, the information that went into proving your safety, that does go out, and it's published. You can ask for redactions for privacy or for IP concerns, but that's not guaranteed, and it's not at all the same level of privacy that you get from Singapore. So in a way, when you see a Singapore approval, you do not necessarily know what was there, and it's really up to the company to describe what they actually did or what safety things that they've proven. So I want to make that distinction on these.
Yeah, I can jump in. On the United States side, I think just more broadly, finally, folks that hadn't yet engaged with the FDA saw exactly what FDA expects, right? FDA expects to understand the upstream process. They want to know about the cell sourcing, the cell isolation, the handling, the storage, the proliferation, differentiation, what inputs you're using, what might bioaccumulate to harmful levels in the harvest cells. So I think it was really insightful. And for the two dossiers that did make it through, you saw different approaches to safety that ended up with, still the same conclusion, but different ways to get there. And it'll be interesting when FDA does publish the guidance to see how they kind of capture that flexibility that is afforded to developers.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And I think this kind of leads us into maybe we can start delving into the safety issues then and what, the different regulatory agencies are looking for and what companies should be concerned about. I see some questions coming in here. So let's just start kind of broad. In your view, what are the kind of key safety considerations? What are things that companies need to be thinking about as you're manufacturing these products? Maybe Elliot, we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think at a high level, there's different categories of hazards and where they might come from. So I think key things to look at are things like allergenicity, your inputs, where they're being sourced from, and whether they're allergens or not, or they could be. Residues are important as well. Considerations. Whatever you put in the product in the media upstream, is that still there in the final product, and what implication does that have on safety? And as Brian was just talking about, we saw a lot in the FDA pre-market consultations on dietary exposure and ways to sort of how do you go about actually calculating the risk assessed with dietary exposure for something that's could be remaining on the product, again related to the potential residues or other inputs that are in the media. So I think those sorts of things are all important to consider. And now we have, as Brian mentioned, some information out there of how companies are going about this. But I don't think all of the answers are there yet.
Any other concerns from the other panelists? That was a really nice overview, Elliot.
Yeah, I would say there's certain concepts that are part of just food regulation in the US and just more broadly on a global scale, like about hazard analysis. And so one thing FDA really wants companies to dig into is identifying potential hazards that might arise at every step and identifying what those mitigating measures are. So even, during cell selection, during production, harvesting, if you're USDA regulated, you'll have to also identify the hazards that might arise during harvesting and food processing and any subsequent formulation and so forth. So I think what's all along what's been the good news is like we're taking concepts that are already part of food safety for conventional foods and applying them to these novel processes. Certainly there's a lot of substances that are used that are unique to producing cultivated meat, and that's part of the complexity in establishing safety and making sure that the final product is wholesome. And so that's what you're seeing in these dossiers that made it through FDA and how they got to a safety conclusion.
Absolutely. We have a couple of specific questions in our chat here about viruses. So Brian from UC Berkeley mentioned that biopharma has, of course, experienced several incidents where their bioreactors have been contaminated by pathogenic viruses. So that, of course, requires shutdowns and destruction of the product itself. So the question is, how will cultured meat companies protect their workers and consumers from this virus risk? Are there things in place right now? Are companies thinking about this?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think at a high level, it's sort of the same approach as what you do for quality control for cell lines in biopharma as well, or any sort of other industry for cell manufacturing. So, I mean, what's actually nice about cultivated meat is that you can do a bunch of QC ahead of time on your cell lines to ensure that there are no microbial contaminants or viral contaminants. I think it's just a matter about being comprehensive with respect to what you're testing for. So I think with cultivated meat, what's sort of nice is that a lot of viruses don't cross species barriers. So the sort of risk with certain viruses is just inherently lowered in terms of to the worker and also to the consumer. But with that said, there's also species specific viruses that one might actually want to look out for that could have sort of human safety consequences. And so you can, test for those things like through PCR methods or immuno methods, et cetera. So I think we can leverage existing tools and methods that have been developed and are pretty well characterized from other industries for cultivated meat. And, as long as you we've seen that in the sort of pre-market consultations as well with, panels of viruses being tested with these cell lines to validate that they're free of viruses. So I think that's the general approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, so lots of identification work needed to be done and testing. And I think Tim had a similar question, but maybe more about kind of upstream processes. So there's been some concern around viruses and contaminants coming from cells. But if the cells are banked and tested upstream, what sort of food safety considerations are given for in process and post harvest? And I think, Elliot, you just kind of addressed a little bit about that. But Tim also mentioned something interesting. Maybe Brian, you can comment on this because I think this is more US focused. But there's a process to make something called like a drug master file in biopharma, where upstream users, or upstream producers and suppliers can put their information into these master files to make the regulatory process easier, maybe for the manufacturers trying to get authorization. So this does not exist yet for cultured meat, I believe. Maybe Brian, you can talk a little bit about that. But yeah, the question is kind of how are we kind of maybe handling the safety considerations from suppliers and upstream?
Yeah, it's certainly an area that FDA is giving strong consideration to. It's an area that I've been engaged on, and I don't think that there's any clear guidance from FDA yet that's been published. So I can leave it like that for now. But FDA is certainly thinking about if, a company, their sole focus is making an input for a cultivated meat company to use as part of their manufacturing process, and those details are confidential. How does FDA get access to that information? And you're exactly right to point to the drug master file as a parallel kind of filing that can be provided to FDA. And I know that FDA is actively thinking about things along those lines. Certainly for certain types of submissions, there's something called a food master file, so FMF. And so, it's a possibility that might be considered, but there's nothing clear from the FDA on that yet. So at least not relevant to this sector.
The question that I think lots of people are thinking about here, what regulatory hurdles, in your experience, have people already gone through, or do we anticipate to occur in future filings? Anyone have any ideas? What are the major hurdles?
Well, the major hurdle is actually analytics. So you have to, first of all, you have to have a sufficient production capacity in order and a knowledge of your process to have the right analytics and have the enough material to put them through to prove your case of safety. So I think there's already a hurdle in, especially depending on what stage of R&D you're in, to actually have the amount of material and have a process that's sufficiently developed, right, that you're willing to go through the process of putting together a safety dossier for it. Because again, this is certainly true for EU. You are getting an okay on a product based on its process, right? And so you can't simply get get an okay on your product and then change everything. Okay, this is going to be great for, it'll be better for cost, right? You've reduced cost, but you've changed your process dramatically. Well, that may mean a whole new analytics. You may have to submit a whole new dossier. So it's really, there already is a hurdle in matching your production process, the volume that you're doing with the safety analytics, and also understanding the safety analytics that you need.
Yeah, I would sort of summarize what I observe is like this chicken and egg problem where regulators need to know what process and inputs that manufacturers are using, and manufacturers want to know how they're going to be regulated. But that's why regulators are saying, talk to us early and often so that they can begin to understand the diversity of approaches that these companies are taking, so that therefore they can actually think about, what they're going to do with respect to safety and regulatory. So that, and I think there's sort of an unfair advantage because there's certain markets like the US where there's a lot of companies and a lot of people targeting that. There's a little bit more clarity. So they know a lot more, when it comes to what manufacturers are actually doing or planning to do. And that's why I think it's important to have regulators talk to regulators in different regions to actually, clarify some of these open questions and to move toward, more sort of harmonization that people talk about. I mean, that's one way to go about things.
Great point. Sorry, go ahead, Dwayne.
I was going to add, there's actually an additional bureaucratic hurdle in the EU after they created it's in the transparency law. So now, so you have to have your experiments, your safety analytics, in order to put together your dossier to prove the safety. At this point, if you're going to be running an experiment, you now have to register the lab that's going to be performing it, as well as the experiment before you've run the experiment. So I guess the idea is, so you're not going to be providing the best data, right? Only the best data. They will know in advance what data you have run because you've already registered your experiment, whether it's going to fail or not, right? And so there's now a bureaucratic hurdle that you have to go through. That's what you're supposed to, if you've not gone through this registration process, it's not going to be allowed in your dossier. Or if they find it in your dossier, you can actually have it paused for 6 months. So you get a 6-month penalty on it.
Yeah, lots to think about in different regions. Certainly something we can dive a little bit into as well, how companies can prepare. But first, I just want to go quickly back to Elliot's comment about how harmonization and other like how regulatory agencies can work together to make this process more efficient, or at least make it a little easier for different companies to go through the process. And I think too, we don't have any regulators on the panel, but perhaps we shouldn't put the whole onus on them to figure it out. We know that industry, academia, and different groups are involved. So Mariela, that makes me think of, you mentioned Codex. So I would love to hear a little more about what other international organizations are doing to work on standards and safety.
Thanks, Kim. I've been listening carefully to what my colleagues were saying, and I guess there are a few things that I would like to mention here. The first one is that there are inherent differences among regulators and what they can and cannot do. And I think that is one aspect that hasn't been too prominently addressed in the discussions that I've been part of. When I think about the science, for instance, well, the science is almost universal, right? It doesn't know jurisdictional boundaries. When I think about sharing that sort of science, the limits are less, or is less constrained than when I think about what regulators can share with each other. Of course, they can share best practices, and indeed they do. We know that they are doing that. But there is a domestic political and legal agenda that they are constrained by. And I spend quite a lot of time thinking about this and the nuances of what is the scope wherein the different regulators are operating in. And I've been looking in particular at what Singapore has been doing for obvious reasons, the first one, right? and thinking whether can we actually transplant that to other places. Now, luckily, we have some more guidance because we see what the US is doing, and we also see quite a few other jurisdictions being more active. Recently, we've probably heard about Israel saying that, oh yeah, the green light, let's go ahead with this. But then again, there are public policy, public law considerations that are not being fed, in my view, into this discussion. So there is, in a way, I'm trying to say there is only so much that we can harmonize. And so this leads me to Codex. And Codex, as we know, is charged with adopting international standards, particularly when it comes to food safety. I was quite surprised to see the speed with which Codex moved when it came to cultivated meat. I haven't seen that before, and I've been studying Codex quite a bit. And it is great news because what we need is agility, right? I mean, technologies are advancing at such a pace, and what we usually see in the regulation of technologies is that the regulation is just not keeping up pace, and that is a problem. And so when I see an institution like Codex being so agile in addressing these sort of issues, cultivated meat safety, it's in my view a good development. Now there is, again, I guess, a caveat. There have been two member states that have been predominantly active in pushing this agenda, right? And so Singapore and Israel have been particularly active in trying to make this happen, which is, again, great in my view. And why do I think that it is particularly beneficial for CELAC in general that we have a cultivated meat food safety international standard? Well, because when we think about what's going to happen eventually when we have the product in the market, there is a sort of presumption of compliance with international obligations if we base our domestic regulations on Codex standards. And that is something that we looked at in particular when we think about dispute resolution in front of places like the World Trade Organization. And if we think about the hormones dispute a couple of decades ago, and what I guess we all want to avoid is cell agriculture cultivated meat being part of such a dispute, right? Just because we didn't take into account different considerations at the time of adopting domestic measures. So I guess what I'm trying to say in short is that if we have an international standard that has been adopted, that will be adopted, and if we have domestic regulations taking account of that standard, then we are already streamlining and simplifying, and in a way preventing potential litigation in the future, which is what I think we're all hoping for.
Yeah, thank you. And I hadn't really thought about the restraints on the different regulators in different regions, but it's very encouraging to hear about the speed at which Codex is moving, because yes, those can be very long consensus-driven processes. This kind of leads me to a bit of a question from Jasmine here about consensus on labeling and naming of cultivated meat and seafood and how that fits into the regulatory and safety landscape. Any thoughts there? Maybe we can start with this. Yes, Mariela, go ahead.
I mean, I don't want to jump in if any of my colleagues would like to go first. So I've been looking at what we call cultivated meat from a trademark law perspective, which is, I guess, in a way unusual because we're not there yet. We don't have the product in the market. But why I've been looking at that is primarily because if we have foodstuffs with standards of identity, with food compositional requirements like meats, then we need to be, in my view, careful as to what sort of trademark we use, what sort of branding we use with our products, right? And we've seen that in the US, and probably Brian can talk a little bit more about that, or is much better informed than I am, where we see different groups trying to use, as it's usually the case, trying to use any available legal tool to protect their industries, right? And so we had the US Common Association saying, well, you can't really call these meats, and in a similar scenario, and so what I perhaps my preliminary conclusion is to basically suggest any industry player trying to place such a product in the market to avoid using the word meat or fish. Now, there are considerations why you would not want to do that, because let's not forget that trademarks have also a communication function, right? And that's how you communicate with consumers. And so you really want to make sure that your consumer knows what the product is about, and that is a tension there that needs to be reconciled somehow. But I think having a sort of international consensus about how we call the product ultimately will simplify a lot of matters.
So on the U.S. side, labeling is certainly an issue that the regulators have been grappling with for quite a bit of time now. In October 2020, the FDA had published a request for information from stakeholders regarding the labeling of cultivated seafood. About a year later, the USDA published something called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for cultivated meat and poultry products and the labeling there. So USDA regulates labeling in a different way than FDA. And so you have to get pre-approval. Essentially, your prior approval is a term of art from USDA if you're a meat or poultry product. And so USDA does plan to roll out regulations in the future for products under its jurisdiction. And FDA plans to at least align on principles regarding labeling. And so, I agree that it would be helpful if, the terminology that's agreed upon, in one jurisdiction kind of translates to others just to streamline. But we know there's other areas like products that, like, I think in the UK, you can't say like soy milk, you have to say soy drink, and minor differences in how you qualify products. But one of the questions in this area for USDA is essentially like what kind of qualifiers should be used, what does a reasonable consumer understand essentially. If we're making a new regulatory standard, should the regulatory standard include like a qualifier like cultivated, or what is that nomenclature? So there's a range of questions that both FDA and USDA have asked industry to comment on, and it's under active consideration at USDA in particular for future rulemaking at the federal agency.
I think one thing I'd like to add is so we don't know how these things are going to end up having to be labeled, and I can even break down in within a jurisdiction. Maybe I don't know. Brian could talk about this, whether individual states could end up affecting this as well. This could actually happen at the member state level. But I did like something that the FAO pointed out in this latest report, which is if there's these restrictive labels, or lobbies come in and they really make it where kind of bury that it is from an animal source, right? And you put a bunch of qualifiers on it, it might bury the fact that you've got an allergen, right? That's going to be important for people to know, right? So it's better to retain some of the animal, right, or nature to it, and not remove it like you want to see, or people want to see, especially for plant-based products.
Yeah, good point, Dwayne.
Yeah, just to Dwayne's point really quickly, on the plant-based side, for those foods, there's been a lot of activity at the state level in the United States, trying to restrict the kinds of terms and words that can be used to describe like a plant-based burger, for example. Some states trying to ban the word or successfully banning the word meat and other meaty sounding terminology. USDA, there's longstanding like case law precedent, and there's statutory language that says that if the USDA, because it does review labels, if they agree on certain terminology, then that preempts basically the state law does not trump the federal law. So assuming that remains the case, then this shouldn't be an issue in the same way that it has been for the plant-based foods or even certain dairy products. And so we're going to keep an eye on that. And but there have been some laws that have been rolled out that could be read as affecting cell-cultured foods. And so I think it raises an interesting question for cell-cultivated seafood, for example, that does fall under FDA oversight, where FDA doesn't have that prior approval role for the labels. But that will take us down like a rabbit hole of just labeling, and so I won't go there. But happy to talk with anyone offline in the audience or on this panel also. Great.
Thanks, Brian. So I want to, I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs in this audience, and perhaps we can get some thoughts from the panelists about maybe when is a good time to start thinking about regulatory and safety issues. How can companies start getting moving on their regulatory compliance?
My answer is going to be immediately. I was head of
I was going to say what you're doing. You have a little
regulatory.
industry experience. Go ahead.
Okay, so realistically, if you're so early in R&D, I mean, you're just ways off from any product. I suppose you don't have to be worrying seriously about it. But I think you have to already have an idea of what it's going to take, right? What the kinds of things you're going to run into. So I'll give the plug for our paper, or both our papers, on safety, and also the FAO report, so you can have an idea of what's coming. But if you are a company and you are shifting towards even a serious level of scale up, I think at that point you already have to have an idea of what are the safety analytics, because that takes a while to actually create. You have to know what your inputs are, right? And it's not just your cells, right? And you have to understand. You even have to have a step back. So if you have a component that's in your media, right, where did that come from, right? Where did they get their raw materials? What could be in this? You already have to be kind of expanding all your concerns. You have to understand these and get these set up and start creating your analytics. And you can even create them before you have product, because you could start measuring stuff on your components to understand what might end up in your what gets consumed over time just through the production process, right? So I would urge to do it early, because if you wait till later, you're going to be caught. I mean, it takes 1.5, 2 years really to do the kind of analytics you need. So you don't want to be so far ahead on your production. You think you're ready, and then you get caught going, okay, now it's going to be another 2 years or whatever, actually assembling the analytics for your dossier.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think that's like a core challenge for this industry. Just, broadly speaking, these companies are backed by venture capital. There's pressure to bring products onto the market. And so, you want to go, once you figure out, hey, this is how we think we're going to go about things. Well, you're going to probably build upon that as your that's your foundation, and everything that's, the sourcing of your inputs, how you're going to scale up, et cetera, and sort of rely on that. Now, I think that can lead to hey, we're bringing a product that's non-optimal, being, it might cost too much, for instance. And then as Dwayne was alluding to, if you have to go back and change things, that can reset the clock either entirely or partially, or delay it. Actually, you saw that in the Good Meat pre-market consultation, where they actually filed an amendment for the levels of folate that was included in the media. Now, that's a small change, but it's still a change. And I think that's like the challenge that companies are going to have to deal with, because this is such a new technology that's being developed. You have only so much time to trial and error before you want to decide on what you're actually going to, what you're going to do, who your suppliers are going to be, that sort of thing. So I think that will be a challenge as more companies try to bring products to market this decade, and whether they can actually get those products to meet other requirements on cost and taste parity and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and another question we've kind of gotten is about how companies can ensure they're compliant. Maybe what are some of the steps they can take? And there's a specific question from Sean Baker about the hazard and critical control plan, plan HACCP. So we know that anyone manufacturing food or dealing with food has to have some certain programs in place to make sure that their food is safe, like good manufacturing practices. So Sean's specific question is, will HACCP be amended to cater towards cultivated meat? Or will the current version of HACCP be directly applied to cultivated meat? Does anyone have any insights there?
Yeah, I can get it started. I mean, in the United States, for the FDA, of course, it's HARP-C now, hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, even if you are making meat and poultry through the cell culture technology. And then, of course, USDA HACCP requirements take over upon harvest. And so the current thinking now is that we apply those principles, which are written really broadly. And so you just tailor it to your specific production process is really how it's done.
I will second that. Yeah, it's so broad that you just tailor to your thing. And I'll point out that so when you do your application, your safety dossier to EFSA, one of the things that they suggest, right, within the guidance documents is a HACCP plan, right? So it's you should be on top of that as well while you're creating your dossier or as you're creating a production process.
Mm-hmm. Great. And thinking about companies and importing and exporting their products, are there any insights into what complexities there may be? How far advanced are we in thinking about this moving product from one region to another?
I don't have any particular inputs on how this will turn out, but I have certainly been thinking about what could potentially happen based on the past, and I think it would be good to tie it up to what colleagues were just saying about your data analytics and how you deal with it from the beginning, because in a way you're also sketching out your supply chain, right? And we're now in a globalized environment, and when you think about Singapore, there is only limited space to produce the product, right? And so we're hearing already that those companies that are involved in regulatory approval processes in Singapore are very clear that the manufacturing will happen somewhere else. And we're used to that, right? But there are risks to that supply chain. What happens if we're again stuck with another pandemic and everything stops, right? How do we ensure the integrity of that global supply chain? What about bioterrorism? I mean, there are a whole sort of questions that I'm not necessarily saying that startups, that companies need to be thinking about these very big questions, but I think those are certainly considerations that need to be in the back of your mind when you're thinking who are going to be your suppliers, where are you going to be buying your bioreactor? If you're based in the US and you're going to be buying a bioreactor in China, what happens if you're affected by trade wars? And so those are certainly, in my view at least, certainly aspects that should be considered from the beginning in order to mitigate whatever issues may arise in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Mariela. We have go ahead, Elliot.
No, I mean, I was just going to comment generally. I mean, I think import-export's interesting because, I think right now it's not necessarily so clear exactly how that's going to work everywhere around the world. And that really dictates some decision-making processes that these startups have to deal with. Like, hey, we might be a company in Israel, but we're building a facility in the US because we don't know how to navigate that, these sorts of things. Also with FDA and USDA, how they split seafood, can you import seafood, cultivated seafood when USDA sort of does the inspections typically. So I think those are some open questions that need to be resolved, but definitely important in dictating some of the short-term decision making that these companies do, especially with respect to where their facilities are located.
Yeah, I can jump in and say that, from my conversations with the regulators, for my clients that are overseas, they're definitely in the early stages at the agencies about thinking about what is the way that they will allow the import. But I think, USDA has another arm to it called APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. And so if you're importing products from overseas, there are certain permits that you need typically to facilitate the import, in addition to any USDA FSIS specific import requirements if you are making cultivated meat or poultry. And then if you're bringing in an FDA regulated product, like a cultivated seafood product, there you have to consider anything from USDA APHIS as well as CBP. So there's a range of there's layers to the process, at least with the United States, that companies need to be thinking about. And I can see that it's very important to a company's decision making on where they're going to open their plants and what they're going to send into the United States or what they want to send in. So,
yeah. Great. Now I'm going to move over to the idea of transparency, robustness of the data that's coming out. We know there hasn't been a ton of public data. We've seen some, but the question is about how academic research can help this. I think also other types of projects. How could transparency and kind of publication of results help this field, and should we encourage it?
Dwayne, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, we should be sharing it. So the fact is already in the, you could say in the production process, we've got silos with these companies, right? And they may be duplicating efforts, right? Let's go to be the same for safety, right? And people or companies could be running into issues, including with their safety analytics, right? Which would be valuable for other companies to know, right? And to develop a body of evidence, right? Across different production processes for these different types of products, right? So you could really start getting a huge database, which it'll help regulators, it'll help other companies understand what they might be facing, and it also helps the consumer understand, well, actually, what does this look like, right? From a safety perspective, or even I would argue nutritional analytics would be nice to see in the public.
Mariela.
I think I would add to that, and we had a similar conversation with Dwayne a couple of weeks ago. I think there's a difference between open science and open access, and I think that nuance is important because there is an inherent tension between innovation that needs to happen so that the technology matures, and the necessity to grant some sort of incentive for that innovation to happen. And I don't want to deal too much with IP right now because this is a food safety panel, right? But this is where IP comes into place. And we've heard a lot about the role of patents and how stakeholders not want to share information based on their IP. And then again, here, a lot of demystifying, I think, should take place. What do we mean by IP? Are we talking about patents? Are we talking about trade secrets? Are we talking about confidentiality agreements? These have different layers of complexity as well, and they have different implications for when we are trying to share so that we can advance the field. So I guess in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that open access is great. Everything that is robust, scientifically robust, and that has been published as such should be made available open access. Open science, I'm not quite sure about that.
Yeah, just this is a really important area, obviously, that nonprofits like ourselves, that New Harvest and GFI care about a lot. So we're just planning some of the cultivated meat related work that we're going to be doing for the rest of the year. And one of those projects is, compiling the existing information on nutrition and other end product characteristics that's in the published literature. So that's something that we're definitely interested in moving toward. I think one of the bottlenecks, though, is that what I've heard is, to actually send sample to these, third-party labs that are going to do these analysis, you actually need, quite a bit of, you might need like 50 grams or something like that. And academic labs they can't produce that amount of tissue right now. So, can these analytical labs, can they deal with smaller amounts of tissue? That would really speed up things in terms of the amount and quantity of data that would be generated. So it's not just, we can't just rely on companies, I think, to give us the information. We also need information coming from a variety of different sources to sort of corroborate things. But there are challenges there.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I can just add to that very quickly, that might well be another reason why funding academic research is so important in this area as well. To keep that neutrality.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going into the last few minutes here, so I've just got one final question for all the panelists. Where do you see the regulatory landscape going in the next year, next 5 years, next 10 years? Feel free to take a stab at any of those timelines that you want. We'll start with you, Brian.
I would say that in the next 5 years, I'm expecting the pathway in the United States at least to become really clear. I think we'll have some solid guidance. I'm expecting it. I think we've been expecting some guidance from FDA at least. I know that FSIS is working on a directive. This is essentially a form of guidance. We'll see, more companies coming through. Looking forward to seeing some USDA grants of inspection for facilities. And some clarity on the labeling. I think on the labeling piece, it was useful to see that when USDA published its ANPR for the labeling, that they said that companies could come to market first through USDA, getting the grant of inspection, and then kind of update their labeling afterwards if their labeling didn't match what USDA ultimately decides is a nomenclature that's considered lawful.
Dwayne?
Okay, so I'm actually, I can't really predict where things will go. I do think that, I see activity, right, across all jurisdictions, but even in Europe, so EFSA is going to have a colloquium. Well, they already just had one on kind of signals for cultured meat or novel foods. They're having a colloquium next month on cultured meat and cell cultured ingredients. So there's an interest within the regulatory agency itself on what to do, right? So I think over the next 5 years, you're going to see, I would like, hopefully, an improvement, maybe some adoption of methods that are being used by other jurisdictions to make it a little bit easier. But I tend to think that the EU will not necessarily be the first port of call, let's say, for companies, just because there's a much easier process in Singapore, and it looks like at the US as well. So I within the next 5 years, I'm not sure we're going to see that, especially when you're talking about genetically modified products. One thing which you might see a development on faster in the EU compared to actually getting a product to the market is tastings. So right now, tastings are not allowed. Public tastings are not allowed. But Netherlands just passed a law allowing this. And right now it's in a process of determining the protocols that would allow tastings within the country. So I think that I can predict will happen. It's just hard to say what's going to happen in the next 5 years as far as actual submissions and acceptance.
Great. And Mariela?
So yes, I guess I tend to be a little bit between what Brian said and what Dwayne said when we think about the UK. What I would think would happen based on what I think right now is that the UK would move faster than the EU, perhaps not as fast as the US. Tastings is a very important consideration because we've seen in the news recently, actually, that tastings have been happening in the UK, in England, after the sign of a disclaimer. So there is, again, a lot of movement happening in the area. So I would expect within the next 12 to 24 months to have some more clarity as to how the sector will develop in the UK.
And Elliot, the final word goes to you.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm just sort of, be interested in tracking like the efficiency of this whole process. I mean, there's a lot of companies worldwide. There's, doing this product by product sort of, rigorous analysis for everything. I mean, that's going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources from these regulatory agencies. What can we be doing to think about the efficiency of these processes? And we're going to be building a body of knowledge with these initial sort of pre-market consultations or other approval. So how can we build on that? Like, do we move towards something that's a little bit more input based than product by product based? You can establish the safety of some of these inputs that are going to be commonly shared throughout the entire industry. You can understand how residues exist on these products, and you can have respect for approvals that happen in one part of the world. You say, okay, well, if it's approved in the US, if it's approved in Europe, that should make it easier for sort of building on the safety precedents for these products. So I'd be interested to see how that all tracks as we move throughout this decade.
Yeah, me too, Elliot. Look forward to seeing much more data coming out there and seeing the ever-evolving regulatory landscape, and hopefully we'll see lots of collaboration happening in the future. So we've reached the end of our time. Thank you so much to all the panelists. This was such an interesting discussion. I know we could have delved much more into so many more topics, so hopefully we'll get a chance to do that in the future. I guess I didn't ask the panelists, but I think they're probably open to people reaching out to them and continuing the discussion on these topics. And yeah, we'd love to thank the hosts of Cultivate Tomorrow for inviting us all to this fascinating discussion. So thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.